The stone is alone when the mist begins to lift. It stands on a low rise above a sleeping landscape taller than any person, heavier than any animal that ever crossed the valley, its surface darkened by rain lichen, and the slow touch of thousands of years. Around it the world has changed beyond recognition. Forests have advanced and retreated. Rivers have shifted their courses. Villages have appeared, burned, vanished, and been forgotten. Languages have risen and died without leaving a sound behind. Yet the stone remains upright in the earth, as if it is still waiting for someone to explain why it was placed there. Across the world, stones like this appear in places that seem almost designed to unsettle the imagination. They stand in long rows on windswept plains in Brittany, where thousands of megaliths stretch across the land like a message written in a script no one can read. They form circles in Britain and Ireland where sunrise and moonrise still slide between ancient gaps, with a precision that may be intentional, symbolic, practical, or all of these at once. They rise from islands in the Mediterranean carved and stacked into temples older than the pyramids. They watch over the grasslands of Mongolia, the deserts of Arabia, the hills of Ethiopia, the coasts of Korea, the forests of Western Europe, and the lonely volcanic slopes of Rapa Nui, where enormous human faces gaze inland with an expression that seems both peaceful and severe. At first glance, a megalith seems simple. It is just a large stone. That is the beginning of the mystery, because almost nothing about these monuments remains simple once one looks closely. A stone must be chosen before it is moved. It must be cut, shaped, dragged, lifted, balanced, aligned, and fixed in place. It must require effort from many hands, and effort on that scale demands a reason. Food must be gathered or stored. Workers must be organized. Knowledge must be shared. Some kind of authority, trust belief, or communal purpose must hold the project together. The stone that appears silent is therefore not silent at all. It implies a crowd, a plan, a season, a memory, and a world of ideas that did not survive in words. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The oldest megaliths force the story far back before the familiar landmarks of ancient history. Long before Rome, long before classical Greece, long before the first pharaohs ruled from the Nile Valley, communities were already raising monuments that required patience and coordination. Some were built by farmers. Some may have been built by people only beginning to settle into farming life. Others belong to cultures whose names are gone, whose stories remain only in pollen grains, tool marks, bones, post holes and stones set into the ground. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of what gives megaliths their strange power. They stand at the edge of history where archaeology must listen to matter itself because no written witness steps forward. In many cases, the stones were not placed in empty landscapes. They were inserted into places already meaningful to the people who lived there. A ridge might overlook a river crossing. A hilltop might be visible from several valleys. A coastline might frame the rising sun at a particular time of year. A burial mound might anchor a community to its dead. The builders did not merely construct objects, they transformed landscapes into memory systems. The land became marked, divided, sanctified, claimed and remembered. A stone could be a boundary, a grave marker, a calendar, a gathering point, a symbol of ancestry, a sign of power, or something for which modern language has no perfect category. That is one reason scholars still debate so many of these monuments. Modern people often want a single answer. They ask whether Stonehenge was a temple, an observatory, a burial ground, or a healing place. They ask whether the Moai of Rapa Nui were religious figures, political symbols, ancestral guardians, or monuments of competition between clans. They ask whether the alignments of Karnak were astronomical, ceremonial, territorial, or mythic. The difficulty is that ancient monuments rarely had only one meaning. A cathedral can be a religious building, a political statement, an engineering achievement, a burial place, a work of art, and a landmark, all at once. Megaliths may have carried similar layers of meaning, but without texts, their full inner world remains partly beyond reach. Still much can be known. Archaeology has stripped away many older fantasies. These monuments were not built by giants, nor by vanished magicians, nor by visitors from the stars. No such explanation is needed. Human beings using ordinary materials and extraordinary cooperation are capable of astonishing work. That truth is less sensational than legend, but far more powerful. It means that small communities with stone tools, wooden sledges, ropes, packed earth ramps, lever systems, and deep social commitment could alter the face of the world in ways still visible thousands of years later. The real mystery is not whether humans could do it. The real mystery is why so many different societies decided that moving the heaviest things in their world was worth the cost. A single standing stone can weigh several tons. Some weigh far more. The great trilithons of Stonehenge include sarsen stones estimated at around 25 tons each, while the largest stones used in some ancient monuments elsewhere reach weights that seem almost unreasonable for societies without modern machinery. Yet the record shows that people repeatedly solved this problem. They quarried rock from distant sources. They dragged stones over land. They floated materials by water where possible. They shaped sockets in earth and packed stones into place. Sometimes they chose stones not because they were convenient, but because they came from particular places. At Stonehenge, the smaller blue stones were transported from Wales over a remarkable distance, though the exact route and method remain debated. This choice suggests that origin mattered. The stone did not merely have size, it had identity. In that sense, megaliths are not just engineering puzzles, they are emotional puzzles. They reveal that ancient people saw landscapes as alive with meaning. A stone from a distant mountain could carry the memory of that mountain. A tomb built from massive slabs could hold the dead, while also declaring that the dead still mattered to the living. A circle of stones could bring people together at certain times of year, turning the movement of the sun into a social event. What survives in the record suggests that megaliths were often less about solving practical problems than about making invisible relationships visible between people and ancestors, people and land people, and sky people, and time. And time is the force that now surrounds them most completely. Many megaliths outlived the cultures that built them by such an enormous span that later peoples invented new meanings for them. Medieval villagers saw ancient stones and imagined devils, saints, giants, or buried kings. Folklore gathered around the monuments like ivy. Some stones were feared, some were touched for luck or fertility, some were broken and reused in walls, churches, roads, and farms. Others were protected by superstition precisely because no one knew who had raised them. The monuments became mysteries not only because their first meanings were lost, but because every later age added another layer of misunderstanding, reverence, and invention. This is why the ancient megaliths remain so compelling. They occupy a rare space between the known and the unknowable. We can measure them, date them, map them, scan the ground beneath them, analyze the tools that shape them, and reconstruct many of the labour methods that made them possible. Yet no scan can fully recover the chant, the fear, the exhaustion, the pride, or the grief of the people who gathered around them. No single explanation fully accounts for the persistence of this impulse across continents and millennia to take stone from the earth, raise it toward the sky, and leave it standing for a future no builder would ever see. So the story begins not with one monument but with a human pattern. Again and again in deep prehistory and early history, people choose stone as their answer to passing time. Wood rots, skin decays, voices disappear, even bones crumble, but stone endures long enough to become almost troubling. It survives the collapse of belief systems, it survives the loss of names, it survives conquest, weather, agriculture, and neglect. It does not explain itself, but it refuses to vanish. And because it refuses to vanish, it forces every later generation to stand before it and ask what kind of world could have made such effort feel necessary. Long before the first cities rise behind walls, long before scribes press signs into clay, long before kings begin carving their names into stone to make power look eternal, people are already changing the land in ways that cannot be explained as simple survival. They live closer to hunger than most modern minds can comfortably imagine. They know the movements of animals, the ripening of wild grains, the dangers of winter, the moods of rivers, the stubbornness of stone, and the small decisions that separate endurance from disappearance. Yet somewhere inside this difficult world, communities begin to spend time and strength on structures that do not directly feed them, shelter them, or defend them. They begin to build for memory for the dead, for the sky, for gatherings, for forces unseen, or for meanings that now remain only partly visible. The first builders of megalithic landscapes are not primitive in the way old histories once imagined. They do not lack intelligence, imagination, or technical skill. What they lack is metal writing wheels in many cases, and the kind of centralized states that later make huge monuments easier to explain. Their world is smaller in population but not smaller in thought. A ridge, a spring, a grove, a cave mouth, a burial place, or a distant mountain may carry a weight of meaning that no map can show. For people living without written archives, landscape itself becomes an archive. Paths remember seasonal journeys. Stones remember ancestors. Hills remember gatherings. The dead are not sealed away from society. They often remain part of it, placed under mounds inside chambers near homes, or at visible points in the land where the living continue to encounter them. This is one of the most important shifts in the long story of megaliths. The stones do not appear from nowhere as isolated marvels. They grow out of much older habits of marking place. Before great standing stones there are post holes where timber circles once stood. Before permanent stone tombs there are graves marked in earthwood, bone, or smaller stones. Before enormous monuments there are repeated visits to meaningful locations. Archaeologists often find that a famous megalithic site sits on top of earlier activity, as if the builders are not inventing sacred space from nothing but hardening it into something more durable. Wood gives way to stone. Temporary gatherings become permanent markers. Memory becomes architecture. The evidence remains incomplete because the earlier stages are often the least visible. Wood decays, hides vanish. Fires leave faint stains. A post hole can be easy to miss, and a ritual act may leave almost no trace at all. What survives tends to favour stone, bone, burnt material, pollen shells, and the chemistry of soil. This means the archaeological record is not a full account of ancient life. It is a damaged filter. It preserves some acts and erases others. A community may have sung, feasted, danced, mourned, negotiated marriages, exchanged goods, and told origin stories at a site for centuries before the first large stone was raised, yet most of that human intensity will disappear without a sentence. Still, the pattern is visible enough. In the centuries when farming spreads through parts of the world, monuments often become larger, more fixed, and more socially demanding. Farming does not simply provide food, it changes time. Hunters and gatherers know seasonal cycles intimately, but farming binds communities to particular fields, harvest storage places and inherited claims. Land becomes not only a place to move through, but a place to return to defend, divide, and remember. ancestors become more than beloved dead. They may become witnesses to belonging. A tomb in the landscape can say that a people have roots here, that their dead are in this soil, that their claim stretches backward beyond living memory. No single explanation fully accounts for every megalithic tomb, but this connection between settlement, ancestry and land appears again and again. In Western Europe, thousands of dolmens and passage graves reveal this growing relationship between stone and the dead. Some are built with enormous upright slabs supporting capstones so heavy they seem to press down on time itself. Others are hidden under mounds, creating dark chambers entered through narrow passages. Inside, archaeologists find human remains that are sometimes carefully arranged, sometimes mixed, sometimes added over generations. These tombs are not always the resting places of single individuals. They can be collective spaces used and reopened where bones may be moved, selected, gathered, or rearranged. That detail is easy to overlook, but it matters. It suggests that death is not always a single private event. It may be a continuing relationship between the living community and the ancestral group. The effort required to build such tombs is significant but not impossible. The stones can be moved with coordinated labour sledges, rollers, ropes, levers, and earth ramps. What is harder to measure is the social agreement behind the work. Someone must persuade others to help. People must return day after day. Food must be provided. Injuries must be endured. Plans must be remembered and adjusted. A monument is therefore not only a stone structure, it is the fossil of cooperation. Even without a palace or a written command, it shows that people can organize around shared belief with remarkable discipline. Scholars still debate exactly how leadership worked in these societies, but the stones prove that leadership, ritual, authority, kinship, obligation, or communal pressure existed in forms strong enough to move tons of rock. One surprising detail is that many early monuments are not built quickly and then abandoned. They are altered, extended, sealed, reopened, rebuilt, and reinterpreted. A mound may begin small and expand over time. A chamber may be modified. A stone setting may be added to an older burial place. This gives megalithic landscapes a living quality. They are not frozen projects with one final meaning. They accumulate meaning through use. A child may grow up seeing a monument already ancient, then help add to it as an adult, while believing the place belongs not only to the living, but to a chain of people stretching backward into a past no one fully remembers. In this way, megaliths create a kind of artificial deep time. They make a young society feel old. The first builders also reveal a truth that modern people sometimes miss. Monumentality does not require cities. It requires motivation. A dispersed farming community can still gather at certain seasons. Families can come from separate settlements, bringing food, tools, animals, and stories. A monument can become the centre that ordinary life lacks. For most of the year, people may live in small groups, working fields, tending animals, gathering resources, and navigating local tensions. Then, at a particular time, they converge on a marked place. The building itself may be only one part of the event. Feasting exchange, marriage alliances, funerary rites, and conflict resolution may all take place around the same stones. The monument is both a destination and an excuse to become a larger society for a moment. This helps explain why megaliths can feel so much larger than the communities that built them. They are not simply products of daily life. They are products of intensified life, of special moments when labour, belief, food, ancestry and landscape come together. The stone that stands alone today may once have stood in a field of movement, smoke rising from fires, people arriving with animals, children watching adults, pull ropes, elders marking directions, bodies being carried, bones being placed, songs or rhythms guiding work, and the heavy silence after a stone finally settles into its socket. None of this can be reconstructed with certainty, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the stones make one thing clear. These people were not merely surviving inside nature, they were beginning to argue with time itself, and the argument grows bolder. Once communities discover that stone can preserve memory longer than any living voice, the scale of ambition expands. A single grave marker becomes a chamber becomes a mound becomes a landscape, a line of stones becomes an avenue, a circle becomes a gathering place where earth and sky seem to meet. What begins as local memory slowly becomes monumental tradition, spreading in different forms across regions, adapting to different landscapes and beliefs. The first builders leave no manifesto explaining their purpose. They leave something more difficult and more enduring places where the human need to belong, remember, and endure has been pressed into the ground with stones too heavy to ignore. The first impression is always the weight. A great stone does not need decoration to create awe. It only has to stand where it should not easily stand. A slab weighing several tons set upright in a field by people without cranes or engines immediately turns the mind toward the same problem that has followed megaliths for centuries. How did they move it? The question is practical, almost plain, yet it opens into a world of labour skill, patience, and social force. To imagine the builders as helpless before stone is a modern mistake. To imagine the workers effortless is another. The truth lies somewhere more interesting in the long space between human limitation and human determination. A megalith begins before anyone touches it with a tool. It begins with selection. Not every stone is suitable, and not every suitable stone is meaningful. Some monuments use local rock taken from outcrops close enough to make transport manageable. Others use stone brought from surprising distances, suggesting that origin matters as much as size. The builders must know the landscape intimately. They know where rock breaks cleanly, where fractures run beneath the surface, where a boulder has already loosened from bedrock, where a slope might help, where mud will swallow effort, where water may carry what land resists. This knowledge is not written down. It lives in memory, in repeated journeys, in skilled observation passed from one generation to the next. Quarrying stone with prehistoric tools is slow but not mysterious. Stone hammers, wooden wedges, antler picks fire water, and patience can open cracks and shape surfaces. A wooden wedge driven into a natural fissure can be soaked until it swells, forcing the stone apart by pressure rather than impact. Hammerstones can bruise and peck surfaces into form. Fire can heat rock, and sudden cooling may weaken it, though the usefulness of this method depends on the stone type and context. The evidence remains incomplete at many sites because quarries were reused buried or eroded, but surviving tool marks show that ancient workers understood material behavior with impressive precision. They did not need modern physics to know how stone answered force. Transport is where the imagination often becomes dramatic. The idea of dragging a multi-ton stone across miles of uneven ground seems absurd until one remembers what coordinated groups can do with simple machines. Ropes made from plant fibre or animal hide, wooden sledges, rollers, greased tracks, packed clay log roads, and seasonal ground conditions all change the problem. Frozen earth, wet grass, prepared paths, and gentle slopes can make movement easier. Waterways, where available, may carry heavy stones on rafts or boats, though loading and unloading create their own hazards. Scholars still debate the exact methods at famous sites, especially where stones travelled long distances, but no single supernatural explanation is required. The missing ingredient is not technology, it is organised labour. That labour must have been intense. A stone may move only a short distance in a day. It may become stuck. Ropes may break. A sledge may twist. A person may be crushed if timing fails. Rain may turn the route into a trap. Heat may exhaust the workers. The larger the stone, the more the project depends on rhythm and command. Pulling is not simply strength, it is coordination. Dozens or hundreds of bodies must act as one body. Someone must decide when to pull, when to brace, when to rest, when to shift a lever, when to widen a path, when to abandon a method that is not working. Even without kings or written orders, such work requires authority. It may be ritual authority, elder authority, clan obligation, seasonal duty, or a shared belief strong enough to make refusal difficult. Raising the stone is a different problem. One common method likely involved digging a pit or socket, sliding one end of the stone toward it, then levering the upper end upward, while packing earth and stones beneath. Ropes could pull from one direction, while teams controlled the descent into the socket. Earth ramps could help lift horizontal stones into position. Once upright, the base would be packed tightly to prevent shifting. For lintels or capstones, builders may have raised stones gradually on timber platforms, packed earthen mounds or ramps, then removed the support once the stone was stable. These methods are slow, dangerous, and demanding, but they are within human possibility. Experimental archaeology has shown that small teams using simple tools can move surprisingly large stones when the process is planned carefully. What remains harder to explain is not the mechanical method, but the willingness to spend so much effort. A community does not move enormous stones casually. It must believe the outcome matters. That belief may be practical in a social sense, even if the monument has no practical use in the ordinary sense. Building together can bind people together. It can display unity to rivals. It can honour the dead, fix a calendar-mark territory, dramatise a myth, or strengthen the position of leaders who control ritual knowledge. The monument may be less a product of power than a way of creating power. Each stone moved proves that the group can act as one. Each successful raising turns cooperation into visible fact. There is a lesser-known clue in the stones themselves. Many are not shaped only for stability. They are sometimes dressed, smoothed, carved, matched, or placed with careful attention to appearance from certain viewpoints. This tells us the builders are not merely solving an engineering challenge. They are composing an experience. A visitor approaching along an avenue may see stones grow larger against the horizon. A chamber may frame a thin blade of sunlight at dawn. A capstone may be chosen because its colour changes when wet. A standing stone may lean slightly not from failure, but from terrain settling, or possibly intentional orientation. What survives in the record suggests that the builders are thinking with the whole body sight movement, light touch, and perhaps sound. Sound is one of the more intriguing uncertainties. Some researchers have explored whether certain stone chambers amplify voices, drums, or low tones in unusual ways. This does not mean that every megalith was designed as an acoustic instrument, and popular claims often go much further than the evidence allows. Still, the idea is not absurd. Anyone who has stood inside a stone chamber knows that sound behaves differently there. A murmur can become intimate. A chant can thicken. A drum beat can seem to come from the walls themselves. For societies where ritual is spoken, sung, or performed, such effects may have mattered, even if they were discovered through experience rather than calculated in advance. The builders also had to manage failure. Some stones broke before they arrived. Some may have been abandoned along routes. Some monuments show changes in plan, suggesting that the final form was not always known from the beginning. This is important because it makes ancient builders more human, not less impressive. They experimented, they adjusted, They learned from stone by struggling with it. The finished monument hides the mistakes, but archaeology sometimes catches the hesitation. An unfinished block, a socket without a stone, a rearranged entrance, a mound extended in a new direction. No single explanation fully accounts for every alteration, but these traces remind us that megaliths were not miracles. They were projects, and projects have setbacks. When the stone finally rose, the moment must have carried enormous force. The landscape changed instantly. What had been horizontal became vertical. What had belonged to the earth now interrupted the sky. People who had known the stone as a burden now saw it become a presence. Children who watched it rise might return as elders and find it still standing unchanged, while human lives had passed around it. That is the hidden brilliance of megalithic engineering. It turns temporary effort into durable authority. The strain of many bodies disappears, but the result remains. The monument does not show the aching hands, the torn ropes, the shouted commands, the fear when the stone tilted too far, or the relief when it held. It shows only the final fact: humans placed this here, and time has not yet removed it. At Göbekli Tepe, the stones rise from a hill that does not look at first like the beginning of a revolution. The place sits in southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge above the Harran Plain, where dry grass, exposed rock and wide sky create a feeling of distance from the modern world. For centuries the hill appeared almost ordinary, a rounded mound shaped by time and human disturbance. Farmers found stones there and moved around them. Archaeologists passed near it and did not immediately grasp what lay beneath. Then excavation began to reveal carved pillars, circular enclosures, animal reliefs, and a date so early that it forced scholars to reconsider one of the most familiar stories about civilization. The old version was neat. First came farming, then permanent villages, then surplus food, then organized religion and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe complicated that sequence. Its earliest monumental phases belong to the pre-pottery Neolithic, around the 10th millennium BCE, before pottery is common in the region, and before the full settled farming societies that later dominate the landscape. The builders are not city people. They are not subjects of a known king. They leave no written record, no royal inscription, no clear statement of purpose. Yet they carve limestone pillars weighing many tons, arrange them in great circular or oval enclosures, decorate them with foxes, snakes, boars, birds, insects, and strange abstract signs, then return again and again to rebuild, modify, and eventually bury parts of the site. This is what makes Göbekli Tepe so unsettling in the best archaeological sense. It does not simply add another monument to the list, it shifts the order of expectation. Here, monumental ritual activity seems to appear at a time when communities are still moving between older hunting and gathering lifeways and emerging forms of cultivation and settlement. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how permanently people lived at or near the site, how the labour was organised, and whether the people who built it were fully hunter-gatherers, early cultivators, or something between categories. But the stones make one point difficult to avoid. The desire to gather around monumental places did not wait for cities. The pillars themselves are unlike the rough standing stones many people imagine when they hear the word megalith. They are T-shaped, carefully shaped from local limestone, and many seem almost anthropomorphic. Some have carved arms running down their sides, hands meeting near the front belts, and cloth-like details. They may represent stylized human or ancestral figures, though their heads are strangely absent or reduced to the horizontal top of the T. The central pillars stand taller than the surrounding ones, creating a sense of presence without a face. It is not clear whether these are gods, ancestors, ritual beings, symbolic humans, or something else entirely. No single explanation fully accounts for their form, and that ambiguity gives them a quiet power. Around them, animals seem to move in stone, foxes stretch along pillar faces, snakes coil and glide, boars, cranes, vultures, wild cattle, and scorpions appear in relief not as decorative afterthoughts, but as charged images. Many of these animals are dangerous, elusive, or symbolically potent. They are not the calm domestic creatures of later farming life. They belong to a wild world. This detail matters because Göbekli Tepe stands at a threshold. Human communities in the region are beginning to transform their relationship with plants, animals, and place, yet the imagery still looks back toward the untamed landscape. The monument seems to gather the wild into a controlled architectural space, as if the builders are bringing the forces outside the settlement into the center of a ritual world. A surprising detail is that the site appears to have been deliberately filled in during parts of its history. Enclosures were buried with debris stone fragments, animal bones, and soil, preserving them in a way that later allowed archaeologists to uncover them with astonishing clarity. The burial was once popularly described as a sudden mysterious act, as if the builders decided to hide their greatest work in one dramatic moment. The reality is more complex. The filling may have happened in phases connected to rebuilding enclosure rituals, changing social needs, or the practical abandonment of older spaces. What survives in the record suggests intentional deposition, but the motives remain debated. The act of burying a monument may not mean rejection. It may mean completion. The bones found at Göbekli Tepe add another layer. Many come from wild animals, including gazelle aurochs, wild boar, and birds. This suggests large-scale feasting or repeated consumption events, though exactly who gathered there and how often remains uncertain. Feasting is not a minor detail. In small-scale societies, feasts can build alliances, display generosity, create obligation, and gather labor. A group that can feed visitors can persuade them. A monument that requires many workers may also require meals, ritual gatherings, and social exchange. The stones and bones together hint at a world where belief, food, labor, and landscape are tightly bound. People may have come for ceremony, for social ties, for seasonal events, for shared identity, or for reasons that do not fit modern categories. The site also raises a difficult question about cause and consequence. Did new ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe help push people toward more settled life by requiring repeated gatherings, food supplies, and coordinated labor? Or did early settlement and resource management make such monuments possible in the first place? Scholars still debate this, and the answer may not be one or the other. Human history rarely moves in a straight line. Ritual could encourage settlement, settlement could support ritual, and both could intensify together. A community might begin by returning seasonally to a powerful place, then gradually invest more labor nearby, cultivate more plants, store more food, and build stronger social connections around the site. The monument may not be the result of a revolution. It may be one of the engines inside it. Göbekli Tepe is often called the world's oldest temple, but even that phrase is more complicated than it sounds. The word temple carries assumptions from later civilizations, priests, gods, formal worship, sacred buildings separated from ordinary life. Göbekli Tepe may have been sacred, but its builders did not necessarily divide the world in the same way. Ritual work, food, hunting memory, and social identity may have overlapped. It may have been a gathering place, a ceremonial center, a monument to ancestors, a stage for myth, a place of initiation or something for which modern vocabulary is too narrow. The safer truth is also the more interesting one. It was a monumental place of extraordinary significance, built by people whose world was changing rapidly, and that is why its stones matter so deeply to the larger mystery of megaliths. They show that giant stone architecture can emerge before the usual signs of civilization. They show that people can organize complex labor without writing or visible kingship. They show that symbolic life can be powerful enough to reshape the land before economic life becomes fully settled. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe do not solve the origin of megaliths, but they move the question into deeper time. They suggest that long before empires used stone to glorify rulers, smaller communities were already using it to face the unknown death animals, seasons, identity, danger, memory, and the invisible order they sense behind the visible world. Standing among those pillars today, even through photographs or reconstructions, one feels the strangeness of a society on the edge of transformation. Behind it lies the older world of hunters, wild herds, open landscapes, and mobile groups. Ahead lies the world of villages, cultivated fields, domesticated animals, and eventually cities. Göbekli Tepe sits between them like a stone hinge. It is not a lost city. It is not proof of a vanished super-civilization. It is something more subtle and perhaps more important evidence that human beings began building the sacred, the communal, and the enduring before they had all the tools that later ages considered necessary. The revolution was not only in food or settlement. It was in imagination made heavy enough to last. Stonehenge does not begin as the monument people recognise. It begins as a place in a wide chalk landscape open to wind weather and long views where traces of human activity gather slowly before the great stones arrive. The famous circle with its upright sarsens and horizontal lintels is only one phase in a much longer transformation. For centuries people come to this part of southern Britain, dig into the chalk raise posts, bury the dead shape banks and ditches mark avenues, and return again to alter what earlier generations have left behind. By the time the larger stones stand in place, the landscape is already thick with memory. This matters because Stonehenge is often imagined as a single brilliant act, a mysterious machine built all at once by people with one clear purpose. The archaeology suggests something stranger and more human. Stonehenge is not one answer. It is a long argument in earth, timber, bone, and stone. Its earliest major phase around the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BCE includes a circular ditch and bank with pits known as Aubrey holes, placed around the inside. Some of these pits held cremated human remains, making Stonehenge in one of its earliest forms a place strongly connected with the dead. Before it becomes the iconic stone monument, it is already a ceremonial and funerary place. The surrounding region deepens the story. Nearby are other monuments. The enormous henge at Durrington Walls, the timber circles the long barrows, the Cursus earthworks the avenue leading toward the River Avon, and countless burial mounds added in later centuries. Stonehenge does not stand alone. It belongs to a ritual landscape where people move between places, perhaps at certain seasons, perhaps in connection with ceremonies that link the living, the dead, the sun, and the ancestors. What survives in the record suggests that the monument is part of a larger choreography. The circle is important, but the movement toward it may have mattered just as much as the arrival. Then come the blue stones, smaller than the great sarsens but mysterious because of their origin. These stones are linked to sources in West Wales more than 100 miles away. How they travelled to Salisbury Plain remains debated. Some scholars argue for human transport by land, river, and possibly sea. Others have considered whether glacial movement may have carried some stones closer before people moved them the rest of the way, though the dominant archaeological discussion still gives serious weight to human selection and transport. The important point is not simply distance, it is choice. The builders did not use only the nearest stone. They brought stones from a particular distant landscape, and that suggests memory, identity, healing traditions, Ancestral connections or sacred geography may have shaped the decision. Later, the enormous sarsen stones are brought from a nearer but still demanding source area, likely the Marlborough Downs region. These are the stones that give Stonehenge its monumental silhouette. They are shaped with remarkable care, dressed and fitted using techniques that imitate woodworking, mortise and tenon joints, tongue and groove connections, curved lintels that follow the circle. This is one of the most surprising details of Stonehenge. The builders are not merely stacking rough boulders. They are translating timber architecture into stone as if they are making a permanent version of something that once belonged to wood. The monument looks ancient and inevitable now, but in its own time it may have represented innovation, memory and transformation all at once. Raising these stones required engineering skill, but again the deeper mystery is social. The great uprights weigh many tons. Their sockets had to be dug into chalk. Their positions had to be carefully planned. The lintels had to be lifted and fitted high above the ground with enough accuracy to remain stable for thousands of years. None of this requires impossible technology, but it does require an extraordinary concentration of labour. People must gather, eat, work and obey a shared rhythm. The landscape around Durrington Walls has produced evidence of large-scale feasting, including animal bones that suggest people came together in significant numbers. Scholars still debate exactly who controlled these gatherings, but Stonehenge clearly belongs to a society capable of mobilizing people across a wide region. The astronomical alignments are real, though they are often exaggerated in popular imagination. The monument is famously aligned with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, and the avenue also participates in this relationship with the solar cycle. In a farming and herding world, the turning of the year is not abstract. It determines hunger, slaughter, storage, travel, and ritual timing. Midwinter may have been especially important, perhaps more important than midsummer, because it marks the darkest point and the beginning of the sun's return. Yet Stonehenge is not simply an observatory in the modern sense. It does not need to be a scientific instrument separated from belief. The sky, the dead, the land, and the community may all meet in the same alignment. The human remains complicate the monument further. Cremated bones from early phases suggest that Stonehenge served as a burial place for selected individuals or groups. Later burials in the wider landscape show that the area continues to attract the dead, including high-status individuals buried with rich goods in the Bronze Age. The famous Amesbury archer buried nearby was not inside Stonehenge itself, but belongs to the broader world that formed around it. His grave goods injuries and isotopic evidence indicating he came from far away reveal a landscape connected to movement status and long-distance identity. Stonehenge is therefore not only a place of local tradition, it stands within networks of people and materials that stretch far beyond the visible horizon. No single explanation fully accounts for Stonehenge. It may have been a place of ancestors, a solar monument, a ceremonial centre, a symbol of unity, a place of healing, a political project, or a route between domains of life and death. These ideas are not mutually exclusive. The temptation to choose only one may say more about modern thinking than Neolithic belief. Ancient monuments often gather meanings rather than exclude them. A stone circle aligned to the sun can also hold the dead. A burial place can also display power. A ritual centre can also organise labour and strengthen alliances. Stonehenge may have endured because it was never only one thing. What makes it especially haunting is the length of its making. Generations altered it without leaving names. Some people who began the first earthwork never saw the sarsens raised. Some who raised the sarsens inherited bluestones already old in local memory. Later people encountered the monument as an ancient presence and added their own burials, stories and fears. By the time written history notices Stonehenge, its makers are already unreachable. The monument has become a question surrounded by grass. And yet the stones are not mute. They tell us that prehistoric Britain contained communities capable of ambition on a scale that still commands attention. They tell us that people crossed distances, gathered labour, honoured selected dead, watched the sun-shaped stone with astonishing care, and built not for immediate need but for continuity. Standing there, one senses that Stonehenge is less a puzzle box with a missing key than a place where many truths overlap. It is an engineered structure, a sacred landscape, a cemetery, a calendar of light, and a monument to cooperation. Its mystery survives not because nothing is known, but because what is known opens onto something larger, a society that made time visible, then left the stones to carry it. The stones of Karnak do not gather into a single circle or one dramatic ruin. They stretch. That is their first strange power. Across the fields and low ridges of southern Brittany near the Atlantic edge of France, thousands of standing stones run in long, ordered lines, sometimes straight, sometimes subtly, bending with the land, sometimes broken by roads, farms, later buildings, and the accidents of time. Seen from the ground, they can feel almost endless. One stone follows another, then another, then another, until the eye loses count and the mind begins to search for a pattern large enough to explain the effort. Karnak is not one monument but a megalithic landscape. Its alignments include famous groups such as Menekka Mario and Kurleskan, where rows of menhirs stand in parallel ranks across broad stretches of terrain. Some stones are low and rounded, almost modest. Others rise taller than a person, rough, and weathered, their surfaces softened by millennia of rain and lichen. The full original arrangement is difficult to reconstruct because stones have fallen, been removed, reused, restored, or disturbed. What survives in the record suggests a prehistoric project of astonishing scale, built mainly during the Neolithic by communities without cities, without writing, and without any surviving explanation of what these lines meant. The scale alone is disorienting. A single standing stone can be explained as a marker. A small circle can be imagined as a gathering place. But thousands of stones placed in rows across the landscape suggest something more collective, more repetitive, and more difficult to reduce to one function. The alignments may have guided processions, marked sacred routes, structured ceremonies, signaled territorial identity, reflected cosmological order, or connected different places of burial and ritual. Scholars still debate the purpose, and no single explanation fully accounts for the whole landscape. Karnak resists the tidy answer because it is not an object. It is a system. The region around Karnak was already rich in megalithic activity before the most famous alignments took form. Nearby are dolmens, tumuli, passage graves, and enormous single stones, including the great broken menhir at Lokmariakwa, once one of the tallest known standing stones in prehistoric Europe before it fell and fractured. That stone's broken length reminds us of something important. Ambition in this landscape was not limited to rows. The people of Neolithic Brittany were experimenting with height-distance burial alignment and visibility on a grand scale. They were turning stone into a language of place long before any written language appeared there. Karnak also sits in a coastal world, and that coastal setting matters. The Atlantic is never far away. During the Neolithic shorelines, wetlands, islands, and river mouths shaped movement, food exchange and memory. Communities here were not isolated peasants in a simple countryside. They belonged to networks that could move objects, ideas, and perhaps people across sea routes and inland paths. Polished stone axes from distant sources, ornaments, pottery styles, and burial practices show that prehistoric Western Europe was connected in ways that are easy to underestimate. The stones of Karnak may look fixed, but the society that raised them likely understood movement very well. One of the lesser-known complexities of Karnak is that its lines are not perfectly uniform. The stones vary in size, spacing, and orientation. Some rows appear to narrow or change as they move across the landscape. Some alignments may relate to enclosures at their ends, while others connect more subtly with terrain. This unevenness has often been treated as a problem, especially by those looking for a single, astronomical code or a perfectly measured plan. But the irregularity may be part of the truth. These were long-lived projects, perhaps built in phases modified by different groups, and adjusted to the land rather than imposed upon it as a modern blueprint. The builders may have cared less about mathematical perfection than about sequence, direction, memory, and experience. The popular imagination has often tried to make Karnak easier by turning it into legend. Medieval stories claim the stones were soldiers transformed into rock, sometimes by a saint, sometimes by supernatural power. Other traditions imagined armies giants or frozen processions. These tales are not archaeology, but they are revealing in another way. Later people saw the rows and instinctively understood them as movements stopped in time. That impression remains powerful. The stones resemble a crowd that has forgotten how to move, or a procession that reached the edge of eternity and stayed there. Even unsupported legends preserve a response to the site's visual force. Modern archaeology brings the mystery back to earth without making it smaller. The stones were likely raised by local communities through repeated effort over generations. They were probably quarried or gathered from nearby sources, then moved and set upright, with methods similar to those used elsewhere. Ropes levers prepared ground and coordinated labor. The technical problem is real, but not impossible. The greater question is why repetition mattered so much. Why raise not 10 stones or 50, but thousands? Why create lines that extend beyond the scale of ordinary gathering? Why make a landscape that seems designed to be walked through rather than merely viewed? A processional interpretation is tempting because the rows create direction. They invite movement. A person walking along them would experience the landscape rhythmically, with stones passing on either side the horizon, opening and closing the scale of the monument changing with each step. If ceremonies move through these alignments, the stones may have shaped the body's experience of sacred space. They could slow people down, gather them into ordered motion, or separate participants from observers. Yet this remains an inference. The evidence does not preserve the ceremony itself. It preserves the architecture of possibility. Astronomical theories also surround Karnak. Some researchers have suggested that certain alignments may relate to solar or lunar events, and it would not be surprising if skywatching played some role in a Neolithic monumental landscape. The cycles of the sun and moon mattered deeply to farming communities, coastal communities, and ritual calendars. But many sweeping claims go beyond what the evidence can securely support. With so many stones across such a large area, it is possible to find apparent alignments that may be meaningful or may be coincidental. The challenge is separating intentional pattern from modern pattern hunting. The evidence remains incomplete, and careful interpretation has to hold both possibilities in view. What Karnak shows most clearly is the power of collective repetition. One stone raised upright is an event. 1,000 stones become a world. The builders created not a monument that points to a single center, but a landscape where meaning unfolds horizontally. The eye travels, the body travels, memory travels. Each stone may have been one act in a long chain, each act repeating and renewing a shared commitment whose exact nature is lost. The result is strangely calm and overwhelming at the same time. Karnak does not crush the viewer with height like a pyramid. It overwhelms through duration, through the sense that human intention has been extended across the earth stone by stone, and because the lines continue beyond easy comprehension, they leave behind one of the purest forms of megalithic mystery. The question is not whether ancient people could raise them. They could. The question is what kind of belief, social order, or inherited obligation made the raising of so many stones feel necessary. Somewhere behind the alignments were hands ropes, songs, meals, disputes, decisions, and generations of people who saw the land differently than we do. They did not leave an explanation. They left a pattern large enough to survive the loss of its meaning. Across the central Mediterranean on islands of limestone dry fields, bright sea and wind-cut cliffs, another form of megalithic mystery takes shape. Malta and Gozo are not large places yet. They hold some of the most astonishing prehistoric stone architecture in the world. The temples there are older than Stonehenge in its famous stone phase, and older than the pyramids of Egypt. They rise from a world without writing, without known kings, without metal tools in their earliest phases, and without any surviving explanation from the people who built them. Their stones are not arranged as long outdoor lines like Karnak, nor as open circles like Stonehenge. They form enclosed spaces, curved rooms, thick walls, paved floors, apses, thresholds, altars, and carefully controlled entrances, as if the builders wanted to guide the body inward from open sunlight into a charged interior world. The first encounter with a Maltese temple can be deceptive. The ruins are low compared with the later monuments, and many walls have lost their original height. But the surviving stones reveal an architectural intelligence that is both practical and strange. At Gyantija on Gozo, huge limestone blocks form walls so massive that later folklore attributed them to giants. The name itself preserves that memory. At Hagarkim and Menadra temples stand near the sea, their pale stones glowing under the Mediterranean sun. At Tarxian, carved spirals, animal reliefs, and carefully worked slabs suggest a symbolic world rich with meanings now only partly recoverable. These are not crude heaps of stone. They are designed spaces shaped for movement, focus, and possibly ceremony. The temple plans often follow a pattern of rounded chambers branching from a central passage. The effect is organic, almost bodily. Instead of straight corridors and rigid geometry, the buildings curve, swell, and narrow. A visitor passes through a doorway, crosses a threshold, enters a chamber, then another, while sightlines shift and spaces unfold gradually. Some stones are pierced with small openings as if allowing controlled glimpses into restricted areas. Others are decorated with spirals, pitted patterns, or relief carvings of animals. The builders understand drama, but not theatrical drama in the modern sense. They understand how stone can hide and reveal how a doorway can separate ordinary ground from special ground, how a chamber can make sound and light feel different. One of the most remarkable details is the contrast between the size of the buildings and the size of the islands. Malta's prehistoric temple culture flourished in an environment with limited land, limited timber, and fragile soils. The communities that built these monuments were farmers and herders relying on crops, animals, marine resources, and exchange. They lived within ecological boundaries that would have been felt constantly. Building with stone made sense in a place where stone was abundant, but the ambition of the temples still demands explanation. To move and raise such blocks required labor planning and shared motivation. Scholars still debate the social organization behind the temples because the evidence does not clearly show kings' palaces or strong social inequality of the later state-based kind. Once again, megaliths reveal power without easy labels. The underground complex known as the Halsaflieni Hypogeum deepens the mystery. Cut into rock beneath the surface, it contains chambers passages and spaces that seem to echo the forms of above-ground temples. It was used for burial, holding the remains of many individuals over time, but it was not simply a storage place for bones. Its architecture suggests ritual care and symbolic design. Some chambers are carved to imitate built stone structures, as if the world of the living and the world of the dead mirrored one another. In the dimness underground, sound behaves in unusual ways, and although claims about acoustic design can sometimes be overstated, the sensory power of the space is undeniable. The dead were placed not in isolation from architecture, but within one of the most elaborate sacred environments of prehistoric Europe. The famous figurines and statues associated with Malta's temple period add another layer. Some show broad-bodied human forms, often called fat ladies in older descriptions, though that phrase is too casual for objects whose meaning remains uncertain. They may represent ancestors, ritual specialists, fertility symbols, deities' idealized bodies, or something else entirely. Their bodies are often emphasized while faces are reduced or absent. This echoes a wider prehistoric pattern in which identity may be less about individual portraiture and more about category, role, abundance, transformation, or sacred presence. No single explanation fully accounts for these figures, but they suggest that the temple world was deeply concerned with bodies' life, death, and perhaps regeneration. The temples also show careful relationships with light. Mnajdra is especially famous for solar alignments where sunlight enters the building at equinoxes and solstices in ways that appear intentional. Such alignments do not mean the temples were observatories in the modern scientific sense. They may have been ritual calendars, seasonal markers, agricultural signals, or symbolic events that tied the architecture to cosmic order. In a farming society on a small island, the return of seasonal cycles would not be abstract. It would be tied to planting, harvesting, animal breeding, and survival. When sunlight enters a stone chamber on a significant day, it turns the sky into part of the building. Yet Malta's temple culture did not last forever. Around the later 3rd millennium BCE, the temple building tradition faded, and the society that created it underwent major change. The reasons remain debated. Environmental stress likely played a role. Soil erosion, deforestation, pressure on resources, and the limits of island agriculture may have weakened the foundations of the system. Climate shifts may have added difficulty. Social tensions, changes in belief, disease, migration, or contact with new groups may also have contributed. The evidence remains incomplete, and collapse is rarely a single event. It is usually a long narrowing of options before a visible break appears in the record. This makes the Maltese temples especially poignant. They are monuments of confidence built in a vulnerable world. Their creators invested enormous energy in stone architecture, ritual spaces, and the dead, while living on islands where ecological balance could not be taken for granted. The temples may have helped hold communities together for centuries. They may have organized labor ceremony, food distribution, identity, and memory. But the same social system that could build magnificently may also have depended on conditions too delicate to survive sustained pressure. What remains is not a simple warning story, but a complicated one. Human beings can create profound beauty and meaning within limits they do not fully control. Today the temples stand under protective shelters and open skies, surrounded by modern roads, fields, and the sea that has always defined the islands. Their builders are gone, their language lost, their ceremonies unrecoverable, yet the stones still preserve the shape of movement, entrance, threshold, chamber, turning pause. Unlike a standing stone that confronts the horizon, a Maltese temple draws the visitor inward. It suggests that some megalithic mysteries were not meant to dominate the landscape from afar, but to create an interior where stone, light, sound, body, and memory could meet. In that inwardness lies their power. They do not explain themselves, but they still feel designed for encounter, as if the builders knew that the deepest mysteries are sometimes not raised toward the sky, but carved into a room of stone and entered in silence. On Sardinia, the towers rise from a landscape of windstone pasture and sea. They appear on hilltops in valleys near springs beside old routes, and above plains where the light changes sharply through the day. Some are ruined down to their cores, others still stand with a heavy brooding dignity, their dark stone walls tapering upward like artificial mountains. They are called nuraghi, and they belong to one of the most distinctive megalithic traditions of the ancient Mediterranean. There are thousands of them across the island. No other landscape has quite the same feeling, a countryside watched by stone towers whose builders left no written history of their own. The nuragic world develops during the Bronze Age, long after the earliest Neolithic megaliths, yet it belongs to the same larger human impulse to make stone carry identity, power and memory. These towers are not simple standing stones or burial chambers. Many are complex structures built from massive blocks arranged without mortar, forming internal chambers, stairways, corridors, upper levels, courtyards, and sometimes entire settlements around them. The simplest nuraghi may be single towers. The most elaborate become multi-towered complexes with bastions and surrounding villages like stone organisms growing outward over time. Their architecture is practical, imposing and mysterious all at once. A nuraghi is built with a technique that depends on weight balance and careful placement. Large stones form thick outer walls, while inner chambers rise with corbelled vaulting, each course of stone projecting slightly inward, until the opening closes near the top. The result can be remarkably stable. Standing inside one of these chambers, a person feels enclosed by mass. The walls are not delicate. They seem to press inward with the authority of the earth itself. Light enters through narrow openings. Sound is absorbed and returned strangely. The space feels defensive but also ceremonial, domestic and symbolic. This ambiguity is the heart of the problem. Scholars still debate what nuraghi were for because they seem to have been too important to serve only one function. For a long time they were often described mainly as fortresses. That interpretation makes sense at first glance. Towers dominate views. Thick walls suggest protection. Some sites control routes, farmland or access to resources. Bronze Age Sardinia was not isolated from conflict, and defensive concerns may have mattered. Yet many nuraghi do not fit neatly into the idea of military forts. Some are not placed in the strongest defensive locations. Some seem tied to villages' storage ritual or social display. Some may have served as symbols of local authority, marking the identity of a community, rather than simply protecting it from attack. No single explanation fully accounts for all of them, especially when their number and variety are considered. The sheer number is astonishing. Sardinia once had many thousands of nuraghi, and thousands still survive in some form. This density suggests a deeply rooted architectural tradition, rather than a small number of exceptional royal projects. The island was not unified under a known empire when these towers were built. Instead, it likely contained many communities, chiefdoms, lineages, or territorial groups interacting, competing, cooperating and defining themselves through stone. A nuraghi may have been a local centre, a landmark, a storehouse, a refuge, a ritual place, a status symbol, or a combination of these. What survives in the record suggests that the towers belong to a world where power was distributed across the landscape rather than concentrated in a single capital. Around some nuraghi villages grew. Circular stone huts cluster near the towers, forming settlements, with shared spaces, workshops, and evidence of everyday life. People cooked, worked repaired tools, tended animals, stored food, shaped metal, and raised children in the shadow of these massive structures. This matters because it pulls the Nuragi down from pure mystery into lived reality. They were not lonely monuments in an empty land. They stood inside communities. Smoke rose near them. Animals moved around them. People entered and exited them for reasons that may have changed through time. A tower that began as a symbol of authority could later become a storage place, a ritual setting a ruin with ancestral power, or a marker of an older social order. Sardinia's Bronze Age society was also connected to the wider Mediterranean. The island had valuable resources, including metals and Nuragic communities, interacted with peoples from the Aegean, the Italian mainland Cyprus, and later Phoenician traders. Objects found on the island and Sardinian-style materials found elsewhere suggest exchange networks that were broader than the tower's heavy local presence might imply. This is a useful contradiction. The Nuragi feel rooted, almost stubbornly local, yet the people who lived around them were part of moving seas, travelling goods and distant contacts. Their stone towers anchored them to Sardinia, while bronze ceramics ideas and perhaps people crossed the water. Another striking feature of the Nuragic world is its ritual architecture beyond the towers themselves. Sacred wells, springs, and water sanctuaries appear across the island, often built with great care and precision. Some have finely cut stone stairs descending into the earth toward water, where light reflection and architecture create a powerful atmosphere. These places show that Nuragic society was not only concerned with defense or display, it also invested deeply in ritual landscapes, especially around water. In a Mediterranean environment where seasonal dryness could shape survival, water was never just a resource. It could be sacred, social, political, and ancestral at once. The small bronze figurines associated with Nuragic culture add a rare glimpse of how people represented themselves in their world. These bronzetti show warriors, archers, chiefs' boats, animals, musicians, and figures with offerings. They are not photographs of society, but they suggest roles, ideals, and identities that mattered. Some figures wear horned helmets, some carry weapons or staffs. Some seem to present gifts. Their stylized forms hint at ceremony's status and perhaps myth. The evidence remains incomplete, but these objects help fill the silence left by the absence of writing. They show a society capable not only of building in stone but of imagining itself in metal. The later history of the Nuragi is also part of their mystery. Many continued to be used, reused, modified, or remembered after their main period of construction ended. As Phoenician, Carthaginian, and Roman influences spread across Sardinia, the old towers remained in the landscape. Some were repurposed, some became ruins, some may have retained local significance long after their original function faded. This afterlife is common among megaliths. Once a structure outlives its builders, it becomes available to new meanings. A tower built by ancestors can become a landmark, a shelter, a warning, a sacred place, or simply an ancient fact too large to ignore. The Nuragi remind us that megalithic architecture is not limited to the Neolithic dawn of farming. It can appear within complex Bronze Age societies connected to trade, metallurgy, territorial identity, and social competition. They also complicate the idea that mystery always means ignorance. Much is known about their construction, distribution, and material culture, yet the central question remains open because function is not the same as meaning. A tower can defend, store, impress, gather, and symbolize all at once. The builders may not have separated these purposes as modern categories do, so the Sardinian towers stand as silent witnesses to a society that refused to vanish completely even without texts. The people are gone, their names mostly lost, but their architectural signature remains repeated across the island with extraordinary insistence. Each naraga is a statement in stone. Here was a community, here was labour, here was authority, here was memory, here was a way of seeing the land. And when evening falls across Sardinia and the towers darken against the ridges, they seem less like abandoned buildings than like the surviving bones of an island civilization still watching the sea. Far out in the Pacific on an island so isolated that distance itself becomes part of the story, the stone faces of Rapa Nui stand with their backs to the sea. They're called moai, and they are among the most recognizable megalithic figures on Earth. Their long heads, heavy brows, straight noses, and solemn mouths seem to hold an expression older than language. Many stand on stone platforms called ahu, facing inland toward the communities they once watched over. Others lie unfinished in the quarry at Rano Raraku, half emerged from volcanic rock, as if work stopped only yesterday, and the island is still waiting for the carvers to return. For generations, Rapa Nui was told as a simple warning story. People arrived on a forested island, built giant statues, cut down every tree to move them, destroyed their environment, collapsed into violence, and left the moai as monuments to ecological suicide. That version is powerful, but archaeology has made it more complicated. Environmental damage was real. Deforestation happened. The island's palm forests disappeared. Rats introduced by humans may have contributed by eating palm seeds and preventing regrowth. Farming became more difficult in some areas, and social pressures increased. But the idea of a sudden self-inflicted collapse, caused only by statue obsession, is too neat. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the balance among ecological change, climate resource pressure, European contact disease slave raiding, and later colonial disruption. The moai themselves were not empty displays of vanity. What survives in the record suggests that they represented powerful ancestors, figures connected to lineage, authority, and protection. Their inward gaze matters. They were not watching ships on the horizon. They were watching the living. Set on ahu platforms near settlements, they helped anchor communities to genealogy and land. In a small island, world ancestry was not abstract. It structured belonging, right status, and memory. A moai made an ancestor visible at monumental scale. It turned descent into stone. Most moai were carved from the compressed volcanic tuff of Rano Raraku, a crater that became both quarry and sacred landscape. The slopes are filled with statues in different stages of completion. Some still cling to the bedrock backs and cut their bodies waiting to be freed. Others stand buried up to their shoulders by centuries of sediment, giving the misleading impression of heads alone until excavation reveals full torsos beneath. This is one of the most surprising details for many people. The famous heads often have bodies, hands, backs, and carved designs. The simplification of them into isolated heads belongs more to modern imagery than to the original monuments. The question of how the moai moved has produced legends, experiments, and long argument. Older theories imagine them dragged horizontally on wooden sledges or rollers, which would have required substantial timber. More recent experimental work has shown that upright statues can be walked using ropes, rocked side to side and forward in controlled motion, matching some oral traditions that the statues walk to their platforms. This does not prove every moai moved in exactly that way, and scholars still debate methods, especially for different sizes and routes. But the walking model has an elegance because it makes the statues active participants in their own movement. A stone ancestor does not merely get hauled like cargo. It advances upright, swaying across the island under human control. That image is powerful, but it should not become fantasy. Walking a moai would have required skill coordination and risk. Teams would need to control ropes from several directions. The path would need preparation. A mistake could topple and damage the statue or injure workers. Some fallen moai along ancient roads may represent transport failures, though interpretation remains debated. The act of moving a statue was likely not just engineering. It may have been ceremonial, competitive, communal, and political. The journey from quarry to ahu could transform raw stone into ancestral presence. The ahu platforms themselves are equally important. They're not just bases. They're carefully built ceremonial structures often associated with burials, cremation deposits, ramps, and community spaces. Some were rebuilt and expanded over time, showing that they remained active parts of social life. The moai and ahu together formed a system of memory. Stone figures rose above stone platforms, and beneath or around them lay the dead, the ancestors, the history of descent groups, and the claims of living communities. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire island's monumental tradition, but the connection between ancestors' land and status appears central. The red stone cylinders placed on some moai, often called pukao, add another level of difficulty and symbolism. These were carved from red scoria at a different quarry and transported separately. They may represent top knots or hair, though their meaning is still discussed. Moving and placing them on top of already massive statues required additional labour and planning. The use of red stone may have carried symbolic value, perhaps connected to sacredness, rank, or vitality. Again, the practical challenge is inseparable from meaning. The more effort required, the more public the statement becomes. Rapa Nui's environment made all of this more precarious. The island is volcanic, remote, and limited in resources. Its soils vary, its rainfall is uneven, and its isolation makes recovery from ecological stress difficult. As forests disappeared, people adapted. They developed lithic mulch gardens using stone fragments to protect soil, moisture, reduce erosion, and improve cultivation. This detail is often left out of collapse narratives, but it matters. The people of Rapa Nui were not simply reckless destroyers. They were skilled survivors in a constrained environment, reshaping agriculture to endure after major ecological change. Their story is not only one of loss, it is also one of adaptation. Still, the statue-building tradition eventually ended, and many moai were toppled in the centuries before and after European arrival. The reasons are complex. Internal conflict may have played a role. Shifts in belief and authority may have mattered. The later Birdman cult at Orongo suggests that religious and political focus changed over time. European contact brought disease, violence, exploitation, and devastating slave raids in the 19th century, which shattered the population and erased much cultural knowledge. Any story that blames the islanders alone ignores the brutality of that later history. The evidence does not support a simple morality tale. The moai endure because they refuse simplicity. They are engineering achievements, ancestral images, political statements, sacred objects, and survivors of ecological and colonial catastrophe. They show that megalithic construction can happen not only in continental landscapes rich with resources, but on a remote island where every tree, stone, and field matters. They also show that monuments can become misunderstood when later observers arrive after a society has been wounded. Europeans saw fallen statues and imagined failure. Archaeology sees a longer story: creation, adaptation, stress, transformation, and survival. On Rapa Nui, the stones do not ask only how humans moved them, they ask how memory moves across disaster. The statues were made to embody ancestors, but they themselves became ancestors of another kind, witnesses to a world partly broken, partly preserved, never fully explained. They stand or lie under the Pacific sky, weathered by salt wind, facing the land where people still live. Their silence is not emptiness, It is the silence left when a culture's deepest meanings survive in stone after too many voices have been taken away. Some megaliths stand where the sea has not yet reached them. Others wait at the edge of tide, half eroded, half remembered, while waves chew at the land around them. And some lie beneath the water, entirely blurred by silt marine growth and the shifting light of a world their builders never intended them to enter. These submerged and coastal stones belong to one of the most difficult parts of the megalithic story, because they force archaeology to look not only at human intention, but at the restless surface of the earth itself. A monument may seem fixed, but shorelines are not. The land people knew 5,000, 8,000 or 10,000 years ago was not always the land that survives today. After the last ice age, as glaciers melted and oceans rose, coastlines around the world changed dramatically. Low plains became seabeds, river valleys became estuaries, islands were cut off, harbours formed where dry land had once stretched for miles. Communities that lived near rich coastal zones often lost their old places to rising water. This matters deeply for prehistory because coasts are attractive to human life. They offer fish, shellfish, birds, salt marshes, travel routes and exchange networks. If early communities built buried, gathered or marked places near ancient shorelines, many traces may now be underwater or destroyed by erosion. The evidence remains incomplete, not only because time passes, but because the sea has taken parts of the archive. This does not mean every underwater stone is a lost temple or proof of a forgotten civilization. Popular imagination moves quickly when ruins appear beneath water. A line of rocks becomes a road, a natural formation becomes a wall, a drowned settlement becomes a vanished empire. Care is necessary. Geology can produce shapes that look artificial. Storms can move stones. Coral erosion and fractured bedrock can deceive the eye. Archaeologists must ask hard questions before calling something a monument. Are there tool marks, repeated patterns, associated artifacts datable, deposits, human remains, construction techniques, or clear relationships to ancient land surfaces? Without that evidence, wonder can outrun truth. Yet genuine submerged prehistoric sites do exist, and they are among the most haunting windows into ancient life. Off some coasts, archaeologists have found drowned settlements, wooden structures, fish traps, hearths, tools and human-made features preserved in waterlogged conditions. In Europe, the shifting post-Ice Age world drowned vast landscapes, including the area often called Doggerland beneath the North Sea, where Mesolithic people once lived on plains that connected Britain to continental Europe. Much of that world is not megalithic in the strict sense, but it reminds us how much human history may lie beneath shallow seas. If entire landscapes vanished underwater, then some early monuments, markers, or sacred places may have vanished with them. Megalithic monuments near modern coasts often preserve the memory of this unstable boundary. In Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, and other Atlantic regions, tombs and standing stones sometimes lie close to shorelines, estuaries, or islands. Some would have had different relationships to the sea when built. A monument that now seems coastal may once have stood inland. Another now inland may once have overlooked a water route. Sea level change, sedimentation and erosion complicate every interpretation. The builders chose places in landscapes that were alive with movement, and modern maps can quietly mislead if they treat those landscapes as static. One famous and debated example of underwater megalithic interpretation comes from the coast near Atlit Yam, in the eastern Mediterranean, a submerged Neolithic settlement off Israel. There, archaeologists have documented stone-built features, human burials, wells, houses, and a circle of standing stones associated with a freshwater spring. The site was not a fantasy ruin, but a real village drowned by rising sea levels thousands of years ago. Its stones remind us that prehistoric communities sometimes built meaningful structures near water sources, and that the sea can preserve as well as destroy. Still, even here, interpretation requires restraint. The stones can be studied, but the ceremonies, fears, and meanings around them remain partly beyond reach. Freshwater lakes also hide ancient stone features. In some places, stone arrangements, crannogs, causeways, or submerged structures reveal that prehistoric people built out into water or used wetlands as ritual and practical zones. Water was never merely a boundary. It could be a road, a food source, a mirror of the sky, a dangerous threshold, a place of offerings, or a route to the dead. Many societies placed objects in lakes, rivers, bogs, and springs, suggesting that watery places carried symbolic force. When megalithic structures appear near water, it is tempting to see them as part of this broader relationship, though each site demands its own evidence. The difficulty of studying submerged megaliths is technical as well as interpretive. Underwater archaeology is slow, expensive, and vulnerable to poor visibility currents, sediment, and modern disturbance. Dating can be difficult if organic material is absent. Stones themselves are hard to date directly. A standing stone underwater may be ancient, but proving when it was set upright requires context. Sediments, nearby artifacts, ancient surfaces, or environmental reconstruction. No single explanation fully accounts for many disputed sites, because the evidence may be thin, damaged, or inaccessible. The sea does not give up its past easily. Still, the idea of drowned megalithic landscapes changes how we think about the monuments that remain on land. What survives may be only a selection. The best preserved sites may not be the most typical. They may simply be the ones lucky enough to escape ploughs quarrying cities, roads, erosion, and the sea. The ancient world was larger than the surviving record. Some alignments are gone, some tombs were broken for building stone, some coastal sites collapsed into waves, some sacred places may now lie under meters of water, their stones buried in sand where only sonar or chance will find them. Archaeology is therefore not a complete map of the past. It is a shoreline after a storm with fragments scattered unevenly. Coastal megaliths also remind us that ancient builders were attentive to horizons. The sea creates dramatic light. Sunrise over water, moonrise over an estuary, storms moving across open distance tides revealing and concealing land. These experiences may have shaped where monuments were placed and how they were used. A tomb overlooking a bay could connect ancestors to routes of travel. A standing stone near a tidal crossing could mark danger, memory, or passage. A chamber aligned with winter light near the coast could turn the meeting of sun and sea into ritual time. What survives in the record suggests that many prehistoric communities did not separate practical and sacred geography. The useful path and the meaningful path could be the same path. In the end, the stones beneath water are not important because they promise hidden Atlantis-like revelations. They are important because they make the known world less complete. They remind us that the builders of megaliths lived on a changing planet, not on the fixed background of a museum display. Seas rose, cliffs fell, rivers shifted. Islands appeared and disappeared as human generations tried to make lasting marks in unstable places. A stone raised near a spring could become a reef. A tomb built above a valley could one day overlook an estuary. A sacred landscape could drown slowly enough that people watched it happen, generation by generation, until memory and water covered the same ground. And somewhere beneath the surface in darkness, green with suspended silt, there may still be stones that once stood in air. They may have marked a gathering place, a grave, a route, a season, or nothing more dramatic than a community's need to say that this place mattered. The sea has softened their edges and hidden their purpose, but not erased the larger truth. Even the heaviest human monuments are built on a moving earth. The ancient builders tried to anchor memory in stone, and sometimes the world itself moved around them. The sky is the oldest clock humans ever studied, and stone is among the oldest materials they used to hold its memory. Long before written calendars, before temple astronomers recorded eclipses, before royal courts turned the heavens into systems of omens, people watched the sun and moon with an attention sharpened by necessity. Light changed the year changed food, food changed survival. Dawn, sunset, moonrise, solstice, equinox, planting, harvest, winter, hunger, summer, abundance, migration, mating seasons, tides and ritual gatherings all belong to the same great pattern of return. It is not surprising that megaliths often seem to turn toward the sky. The difficult question is how precisely, how intentionally, and for what purpose. At some monuments, the relationship between stone and sky is hard to dismiss. Newgrange in Ireland offers one of the clearest examples. There, a passage tomb built around the late 4th millennium BCE admits sunlight into its inner chamber around the winter solstice through a carefully placed roof box above the entrance. For a few brief minutes, if weather allows, the low winter sun reaches into the darkness and lights the passage. This is not a vague alignment found by chance among thousands of stones. It is architecture shaped around a rare event of light. The builders created a chamber for the dead, but they also allowed the reborn sun of midwinter to enter it. Death, darkness, and renewal meet in one controlled beam. Stonehenge also carries strong solar alignments, especially toward midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. Yet even here caution matters. A monument aligned to the sun is not automatically an observatory in the modern sense. The builders may not have been measuring celestial mechanics for abstract curiosity. They may have been staging moments when the movement of the heavens confirmed social order, ritual timing, ancestral presence, or seasonal transition. In many traditional societies, sky knowledge is practical and sacred at once. Knowing when the year turns can guide feasting, slaughter, travel, planting, or ceremony, while also placing human life inside a cosmic rhythm that feels larger than any single generation. The moon complicates the story further. Lunar cycles are more subtle than solar ones. The moon changes shape, rises at shifting times, and reaches extreme positions over longer cycles that are harder to observe. Some researchers have argued that certain megalithic sites encode lunar standstills or other lunar events. In a few cases, the evidence is intriguing. In many others, it remains debated. The danger is that with enough stones gaps and sightlines, modern observers can find alignments that may never have mattered to the builders. This does not mean ancient people lacked lunar knowledge. They almost certainly watched the moon closely. It means that proving intentional lunar architecture requires stronger evidence than a line drawn across a map. This is where the mystery becomes disciplined. The most convincing archaeoastronomy does not simply point from one stone to one horizon event. It asks whether the alignment fits the date of construction, whether the ancient horizon is known, whether the arrangement is repeated, whether the sight line is architecturally emphasized, whether the event would have been visible, and whether the interpretation matches the site's broader archaeological context. Without that care, every old stone can become a cosmic machine, and the real ancient achievement gets buried under modern projection. Scholars still debate many proposed alignments because the evidence remains incomplete, but the careful debates are far more interesting than easy certainty. One lesser-known detail is that alignment may not always be about exact prediction. It can be about experience. A passage may not need to function as a perfect calendar to create a powerful seasonal event. A stone avenue may guide people toward a sunrise not because they need to calculate the day, but because walking toward the returning light transforms the season into a ceremony. A circle may frame the moon at certain times not as a technical instrument, but as a way of making celestial order visible to a gathered community. The sky becomes social when people watch it together. The stone gives that shared watching a place. There is also a difference between marking time and controlling it. A modern calendar quietly tells people what day it is. A megalithic alignment may have required waiting, gathering, and seeing. Clouds could ruin the moment. Mist could hide the horizon. The sun might appear only briefly or not at all. That uncertainty may have made the event more powerful, not less. When light finally entered a chamber after days of expectation, it would not feel like a mere measurement. It would feel like confirmation. The world had turned again. The dead remained in place. The community had returned. The stone had remembered correctly. Astronomical knowledge may have belonged to specialists, but it also may have been widely shared in practical form. Farmers, herders, fishers and travellers all watch the sky. They do not need formal priesthoods to know that certain stars appear before seasonal change or that the sun rises farther north and south through the year. But turning that knowledge into architecture suggests something more formalized. It means people cared enough to build the cycle into stone, a horizon observation that one person can make with a stick becomes a communal monument when it's embedded in a passage tomb or stone circle. The private act of watching becomes public memory. The skyward dimension of megaliths also helps explain why these monuments can feel larger than their physical size. A standing stone may be only a few meters tall, but if it frames a solstice sunrise, it participates in the movement of the solar year. A burial chamber may be small, but if light enters it only at midwinter, it links the enclosed dead to the turning cosmos. This is the genius of alignment. It makes stone land and sky depend on one another. The monument is incomplete without the horizon. The horizon is given meaning by the stone. The event is completed by human witnesses. Still no single explanation fully accounts for megalithic astronomy. Some monuments have clear alignments, others have weak or disputed ones. Some may have been oriented toward landscape features rather than celestial events. Some may have changed through rebuilding, making original intentions hard to recover. Some alignments may be accidental, especially in regions crowded with stones. The temptation to turn every megalith into an astronomical device should be resisted. Ancient builders had many concerns: ancestors, territory, water routes, status, memory, burial, and ritual. The sky was one layer among many, not always the master key. What survives in the record suggests something subtler and more human. Megalithic people did not look at the heavens as detached scientists nor as ignorant dreamers. They lived beneath a sky that governed light time, cold growth, travel tides, and ritual expectation. They watched carefully because their lives required it. They built carefully because memory required it. When they aligned stone with sun or moon, they were not solving a puzzle for us. They were placing their communities inside a repeating order that seemed both natural and sacred, and so at certain monuments the most important moment is not the raising of the stone but the arrival of light years later. A generation builds the passage, another generation maintains the mound, another stands in darkness waiting for dawn. Then the sun reaches the horizon, and a narrow beam slips into the chamber, touching stone that human hands placed with intention long before. For a few minutes the monument speaks without words. It says that time returns, that the dead are not entirely gone, that the sky can be brought into the earth, and that human beings, fragile as they are, once learned how to make stone remember the path of the sun. The dead are among the oldest reasons human beings begin to build beyond immediate need. A shelter protects the living from rain, wind, cold, and animals. A storage pit protects grain from hunger. A wall protects a settlement from threat. But a tomb protects something harder to define. It protects memory, identity, grief, ancestry, and the idea that those who've vanished from sight still belong somewhere. Many megaliths make the most sense when seen not as puzzles of engineering or astronomy first, but as structures built around the continuing presence of the dead. Across prehistoric Europe and beyond dolmens cairns, passage graves, chambered tombs, and stone-lined burial places appear with enormous variety. Some are stark and simple upright slabs supporting a capstone, creating a chamber that later ages often imagined as a table for giants or spirits. Others are elaborate, hidden beneath mounds of earth, and stone entered through narrow passages that lead into chambers where bones, ashes, offerings, and silence gathered over generations. These monuments do not all belong to one culture or one belief system. They differ in date, region, construction, and use. Yet many share a basic impulse to make death durable in the landscape. Inside these tombs, the human remains often do not resemble the neat burials modern people might expect. Bodies may have been placed removed, rearranged, burned, mixed, or selected. Skulls, long bones, or fragments may receive special attention. Some tombs contain remains of many individuals added over time, while others hold only a few. This is one of the more surprising details of megalithic burial. The tomb is not always a closed final resting place. It can be a space of repeated encounter. The living may return to the dead, open the chamber, move bones, add new remains, perform rites, and renew relationships with ancestors whose individuality slowly merges into a collective presence. That collective presence matters. In societies without written genealogies, ancestors can help anchor identity. A tomb in the land says that people have been here before the present generation. It gives depth to belonging. It can support claims to fields, grazing grounds, roots, or sacred places. It can also bind scattered families into a larger community through shared descent, whether biological, social, or mythic. Scholars still debate how literally these tombs represent kin groups, elites, ritual communities, or broader ancestral collectives, because the evidence varies from site to site. Ancient DNA has opened new windows into relationships among some buried individuals, but it has not reduced burial meaning to biology alone. Kinship can be made by ritual as well as blood. The architecture of many tombs seems designed to change the living person's state of mind. A passage grave forces the body to lower, enter, turn, and adjust to darkness. Outside, the world is open, windy, and bright. Inside, sound changes, air cools. Stone closes around the visitor. The chamber becomes a boundary space, neither fully in the living world nor entirely separate from it. If light enters only at certain times of year, the effect becomes even stronger. The tomb is not just a container for bones. It is an instrument of experience guiding the living into contact with memory, fear, reverence, or renewal. Offerings found in some burial contexts suggest that the dead were not treated as discarded bodies. Pottery tools, beads, animal bones, shells, pigments, and other objects may accompany remains, though the meaning of each deposit is often uncertain. Some offerings may have served the dead, others may have marked status, identity, ceremony, or the act of giving itself. In many cases, what survives is only a small part of what was placed there. Food decays, wood vanishes, cloth disappears, spoken words leave nothing. The evidence remains incomplete, but the care invested in burial architecture shows that death generated obligations strong enough to move stone. Megalithic tombs also create relationships between the dead and the sky, the dead and the land, the dead and the living path. A mound may be placed where it can be seen from a distance. A chamber may face sunrise, sunset, a mountain, a river, or another monument. Some tombs cluster together, turning whole landscapes into ancestral fields. A person moving through such a landscape would not see empty countryside. They would see remembered presences. The dead stood in the land through stone, and the living moved among them as part of ordinary and ceremonial life. Yet the dead were not always peaceful symbols. Ancestors can unite, but they can also divide. Control over tombs may have meant control over memory. Certain groups may have claimed privileged access to burial chambers or rituals. Some individuals may have been included while others were excluded. A collective tomb can appear communal, but it may still reflect hierarchy, selection, or conflict. No single explanation fully accounts for who received megalithic burial and who did not. The missing bodies matter as much as the bodies found. For every person placed beneath stone, many others may have been buried in ways that left no trace exposed, cremated elsewhere, or remembered through practices archaeology cannot easily see. This makes megalithic tombs both intimate and political. They hold grief, but they also organize society. They allow a community to say who belongs, who is remembered, whose ancestors matter, and where continuity is rooted. A tomb can comfort the living by giving the dead a place, but it can also instruct the living by making the past visible and heavy. Stone has authority because it seems older than argument. Once a burial monument stands, it can turn a claim into a fact of landscape. The ancestors are here. The stones say so. Over time, many tombs changed meaning. Some were reopened centuries after their first use. Some received later burials from people who did not fully share the beliefs of the original builders. Some were robbed, feared, revered, or woven into folklore. In many regions, later villagers called dolmens giants' graves, fairy houses, devil's tables, or the work of vanished races. These stories are not accurate explanations of Neolithic belief, but they show that the monuments continued to feel inhabited by the unknown. Even after the original ancestors were forgotten, the idea of presence remained. What survives most powerfully in these burial monuments is the refusal to let death disappear completely. The builders knew bodies changed. They had seen decay, burning fragmentation, and the return of flesh to earth. Yet they answered that fragility with stone. They made chambers where bones could gather and mounds where memory could take shape. They created places that later generations would approach with caution, reverence, fear, or curiosity. In doing so, they made death social rather than merely biological. The great standing stones and circles often attract the most attention because they dominate open space, but the tombs reveal the emotional foundation beneath the megalithic world. Stone is raised not only to watch the sky or impress the living, but to hold relationships across the break of death. The dead become part of architecture. Architecture becomes part of ancestry. Ancestry becomes part of land. And the land marked by tombs begins to remember more than any voice can carry. So when a dolmen stands in a field today stripped of its mound, its chamber exposed to weather, it is easy to see only a skeletal ruin. But once it was enclosed, approached, entered, perhaps feared, perhaps beloved. It held people whose names are gone but whose presence shaped the choices of the living. The stones do not tell us exactly what those people believed. They tell us something more basic and more enduring, that the living could not leave the dead behind, and so they built places where the dead could remain. The most misleading thing about ancient monument building is the assumption that power must always look familiar. Modern eyes search for palaces, thrones, royal graves, armies, tax collectors, overseers, and written commands. If those signs are absent, the work can seem impossible to explain. How can people without kings build with the discipline of kingdoms? How can villages raise stones that seem to demand a state? Yet the megalithic world repeatedly shows that authority can exist without wearing a crown, and cooperation can become monumental before bureaucracy learns to write its own name. Many megalithic societies were not equal in any simple or romantic sense, but they were also not always organized like later kingdoms. The archaeological evidence for early monument builders often shows communities with limited signs of centralized rule. There may be differences in grave goods access to materials or burial treatment, but not always the sharp hierarchy associated with palaces and royal dynasties. This creates a puzzle. The stones clearly required planning and labor. The question is, what kind of social force gathered that labor? Scholars still debate the answer because social power leaves uneven traces. A ruler's palace can collapse and still be seen. A ritual obligation, a seasonal alliance, or a respected elder's influence may vanish almost completely. One possibility is that monument building helped create leadership rather than simply expressing it. A person or group able to organize feasts, predict seasonal ceremonies, remember ancestral rules, negotiate between families, or control access to sacred places could gain influence through the process of building. The monument becomes a stage on which authority is performed. Those who know where the stone should stand when the gathering should happen, which ancestors are invoked, and how labor should be divided may become powerful because others accept that knowledge as necessary. Power here is not only force, it is memory, persuasion, ritual skill, and the ability to make many people act together. Feasting may have been central to this process. Around several major prehistoric monument landscapes, archaeologists find evidence of large gatherings where animals were slaughtered, food was consumed, and people came together at scales larger than ordinary village life. Food is never just food in such settings. It creates obligation. A host who feeds many people gains status. A family that contributes animals demonstrates wealth, generosity, or loyalty. A feast can settle disputes, arrange marriages, renew alliances, and recruit labor. Pulling a stone may be exhausting, but pulling a stone after a shared feast under the eyes of kin and ancestors inside a ritual calendar becomes part of belonging. Refusing may not be easy when the whole social world is watching. The labor itself may have been meaningful. Modern thinking often separates work from ceremony, but ancient communities may not have done so. Dragging, lifting, chanting, carrying ropes, preparing paths, digging sockets, and packing stones could all be ritual acts. The monument was not merely the finished product. The building process may have been the ceremony. People who participated could later point to the stone and know their own bodies had helped raise it. That creates attachment. A monument built by hired labor belongs to the patron. A monument built by communal labor belongs to memory. This helps explain why some megalithic projects unfold over generations. They are not always efficient. They may be intentionally repetitive, renewing social bonds each time work resumes. A community may gather to add stones, repair a mound, reopen a chamber, or extend an avenue not because the structure is incomplete in a technical sense, but because the act of working on it keeps the community itself intact. No single explanation fully accounts for every site, but many monuments seem less like finished objects than like long-term social processes hardened into stone. The absence of writing also changes the role of monuments. In literate states, records can preserve laws, genealogies, transactions, and royal achievements. In non-literate societies, memory needs other supports. A stone circle, a tomb, a tower, or an alignment can serve as a memory device not in the sense of a simple code, but as a place where stories are repeated and anchored. The stone does not contain the story by itself, It summons the people who know how to tell it. When those people disappear, the stone remains, but the spoken system around it collapses. This is one reason megaliths feel so enigmatic today. We have the memory device without the memory. There is a lesser-known form of power hidden in standardization. When communities across a region build similar tombs, raise similar stones, or use similar orientations, they are participating in a shared tradition. That shared style can create belonging across distance. People who meet at gatherings may recognize familiar forms and practices. A dolmen in one valley may echo a dolmen in another. A passage grave may follow a pattern known across a wider cultural world. This does not require an empire. Traditions can spread through marriage, exchange, migration, imitation, and prestige. In such cases, megaliths become a network of ideas as much as a network of stones. Competition may also have driven scale. If one community raises a large stone, another may raise a larger one. If one lineage builds a tomb, another may expand theirs. This does not reduce megaliths to vanity. Competition and belief can work together. A monument can honor ancestors sincerely, while also proving that a group has labor, resources, and allies. It can express devotion and rivalry in the same gesture. The great stones do not need kings to become political. Any public act that organizes people, claims land, and lasts for generations is political in the broadest sense. Yet cooperation at this scale is fragile. It depends on trust obligation and shared expectations. If harvests fail, if disease spreads, if conflict intensifies, if climate shifts, if trade routes change, the ability to maintain monument traditions may weaken. Many megalithic systems eventually fade, not always through catastrophe but through transformation. New burial customs appear, metal tools spread, social hierarchies change, settlements reorganize. Old sacred places remain, but their active role diminishes. The stones outlast the social worlds that made them possible. What survives in the records suggests that megalithic builders lived inside social systems more flexible and complex than old stereotypes allow. They were neither simple egalitarian villagers happily dragging stones for no reason, nor subjects of invisible monarchs commanding slave armies. They were communities negotiating identity, authority, ancestry, and survival through acts of shared construction. Their leaders may have been temporary ritual, hereditary, persuasive, or situational. Their power may have depended less on punishment than on the ability to gather people around meaning. This is one of the great lessons of the megaliths. Civilization is not the only source of monumentality. A state can command labor, but so can belief. A king can order a pyramid, but ancestors can demand a tomb. A bureaucracy can assign workers, but a feast, a seasonal gathering, a marriage alliance, or a sacred obligation can draw people from scattered homes into one immense task. The stones stand because human societies are capable of becoming larger than themselves for brief intense moments, and when those moments pass, stone remains as their witness. The palace leaves records of rulers. The megalith leaves records of cooperation. It tells us that people without writing could still think historically, that people without cities could still reshape landscapes, that people without kings could still make power visible. The ancient builders did not need to explain their social order in inscriptions. They placed it upright in the earth. Every standing stone is a trace of many hands acting together, and every trace reminds us that the earliest forms of power were not always built above the people. Sometimes they were built between them. The older a stone becomes, the more easily imagination gathers around it. A monument without an inscription is an invitation. It does not say who built it, what language they spoke, what songs they used, what fears they carried, or what ceremonies unfolded at its base. It stands there with the confidence of fact and the silence of a locked door. Into that silence later ages pour stories. Giants raise the stones, wizards command them, devils drop them, lost races vanish after building them. Visitors from the stars descend, arrange the rocks, and depart without leaving a single tool, bone hearth, or ordinary piece of evidence behind. The megalith becomes not only an ancient monument, but a mirror for modern desire. This is where the story must slow down and separate two kinds of mystery. There is the real mystery, which is difficult, patient, and grounded in evidence. It asks how people organize labor, why certain stones were chosen, what rituals occurred, how monuments changed over time, and what lost meanings once connected land-sky ancestors and community. Then there is the manufactured mystery, which begins by assuming ancient people could not have done what the stones prove they did. That second mystery often sounds more dramatic, but it is usually smaller. It takes human achievement and hands it to fantasy. The claim that megaliths required a vanished super-civilization appears again and again in different costumes. Sometimes the builders are imagined as survivors of Atlantis. Sometimes they are global sages carrying secret astronomical knowledge from continent to continent. Sometimes they are aliens because the old prejudice remains stubborn: if people with stone tools moved great stones, then they must have had help from somewhere beyond ordinary humanity. The problem is not that speculation exists. Speculation can begin good questions. The problem is when unsupported speculation is treated as an answer, especially when it ignores the archaeological record already showing local labor, local materials, evolving traditions, tool marks, quarry sites, settlement evidence, burials, and gradual construction phases. Real archaeology rarely gives the clean drama of a legend. It gives fragments, a flint scraper, a buried post hole, a line of stake marks, a cattle bone with butchery traces, pollen from a vanished forest, isotopes in a tooth, a stone socket, a broken hammerstone, a charcoal sample. These pieces may seem modest beside a giant monument, but they are how the human world returns. They show that megaliths belong to societies with economies, meals, injuries, tools, rituals, and ordinary days. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is not absent. The builders were not ghosts. They were people with hands hard enough to shape stone, and social worlds strong enough to make the work meaningful. Fringe theories often make one mistake before all others. They mistake difficulty for impossibility. Moving a 20-ton stone is difficult. Aligning a monument to the solstice is difficult. Building a corbelled chamber is difficult. Transporting stone over long distances is difficult. But none of these tasks are impossible for organized communities using simple technologies intelligently. Experimental archaeology, ethnographic comparison, engineering analysis, and direct evidence from ancient sites all show that people can solve heavy problems with levers, ropes, sledges, ramps, rollers, prepared tracks, boats, and coordinated labor. The achievement remains impressive precisely because it is human. Making it impossible does not honor the builders, it erases them. Another common error is to treat ancient people as either ignorant or omniscient. In some popular stories, megalithic builders are portrayed as helpless primitives unless given secret knowledge. In others, they become master scientists encoding advanced mathematics, global maps, energy grids, or messages for future civilizations. Both extremes flatten the past. Ancient communities could be observant, skilled, symbolic, experimental, and precise without being modern engineers in disguise. They could align monuments to sunlight without possessing telescopes. They could move enormous stones without engines. They could encode meaning in landscape without writing equations. Their knowledge was real, but it belonged to their world, not to every modern fantasy projected backward. This does not mean all mainstream interpretations are settled. far from it. Scholars still debate the purpose of Karnak's alignments, the full social meaning of Göbekli Tepe, the transport routes of Stonehenge's bluestones, the changing roles of Sardinia's nuragi, the exact reasons Malta's temple culture faded, and the balance of ecological and historical pressures on Rapa Nui. These are genuine mysteries because the evidence allows more than one careful interpretation. They do not require unsupported inventions to be fascinating. In fact, they become more fascinating when uncertainty is treated honestly. There is also a human reason fringe theories endure. The past feels more enchanted when it seems to contain a hidden key. A lost civilization, a secret code or forbidden technology offers the thrill of revelation. It suggests that the world once held knowledge now denied to ordinary people. Megaliths are especially vulnerable to this because they are visually powerful and verbally silent. A pyramid covered in inscriptions may still be misunderstood, but it speaks enough to resist some fantasies. A standing stone in a field cannot defend itself. Its silence can be made to say almost anything. Yet the real enchantment is not weaker than the invented one. It is stronger. Consider what is already known. Thousands of years ago, communities with no metal cranes, no written blueprints, and no modern machines gathered enough people to quarry, stone move it across difficult terrain, raise it upright, align it with land and sky, and return to it across generations. They built tombs where the dead remained socially present. They created temples on small islands under ecological pressure. They carved ancestral figures from volcanic rock on one of the world's most remote inhabited islands. They raised towers across Sardinia lines, across Brittany circles, across Britain, and pillars in southeastern Anatolia before the full dawn of settled farming. No single explanation fully accounts for all of this because human life is not single cause. That is not a weakness of the story. It is the story. The careful approach also protects the dignity of different ancient cultures. Too often, claims of outside help appear most strongly around monuments built by non-European or indigenous peoples, as if their achievements need extraordinary explanation, while familiar civilizations are granted competence. This pattern has a long and troubling history. To say that Rapa Nui ancestors moved Moai through organized skill is not dull. It is respect. To say that Neolithic builders shaped Stonehenge through generations of work is not reducing the mystery. It is restoring it to the people who earned it. To say that Göbekli Tepe was built by communities at the edge of farming, rather than by a lost empire, makes it more revolutionary, not less. The real mysteries left behind by megaliths are quieter but deeper. Why did stone become the chosen medium of endurance in so many places? How did ritual authority form before states? What did ancestors mean to communities whose dead were gathered, moved, and revisited? How did sky watching become architecture? Why did some societies invest so heavily in monuments, and then abandon or transform those traditions? How many coastal or wooden monuments have vanished without trace? What parts of ancient belief can never be recovered because they lived only in gesture, sound, and story? These questions do not close quickly. They keep the stones alive. So the task is not to drain wonder from the monuments. It is to aim wonder more carefully. A megalith does not need aliens, giants, or secret global masters to be extraordinary. It only needs to be seen clearly as the result of human beings facing death, time, land, sky, and each other with tools that seem simple, and intentions that were anything but simple. The stones remain unexplained in some of their meanings, but not because their builders were beyond humanity. They remain mysterious because they were fully human, and much of what makes humans human does not fossilize. What the stones still know is not written on their surfaces in any language that can be read directly. It is held in placement, weight wear, breakage repetition, and survival. A standing stone knows the direction from which it was dragged, though the tracks have vanished. A tomb knows the hands that sealed it, though the hands are dust. A carved pillar knows the animal world its makers feared and honoured, though the meanings of the carvings have thinned into scholarly argument. A stone circle knows the angle of winter light. A sea-edge monument knows that the coastline has moved. A tower in Sardinia knows that communities once organised themselves around its shadow. None of this knowledge speaks easily. It waits for excavation, measurement, comparison, and imagination disciplined by evidence. By the end of the megalithic story, the first temptation is to gather all these monuments under one grand explanation. It would be satisfying to say that they are all temples, all calendars, all tombs, all power displays, or all remnants of one forgotten tradition. But the stones resist that simplicity. Megaliths were built by different peoples across huge spans of time, from early ritual communities near the dawn of farming to Bronze Age island societies and later monument builders in distant oceans. They do not share one origin, one religion, or one purpose. What they share is a material choice and a human instinct. When something matters enough, make it heavy, make it visible, and make it last. That instinct appears in different landscapes because human problems repeat even when cultures do not. Every society must face death. Every society must organize memory. Every society must negotiate belonging territory, cooperation, fear, and the passing of seasons. Some societies answer with songs, some with painted walls, some with burial mounds, carved wood, woven cloth metal offerings, earthworks, or written texts. Megalithic societies answered at least partly with stone. Stone was not the only medium of their worlds, but it is the one that survived most stubbornly. This survival can distort the past, making stone seem more central than it always was. The evidence remains incomplete because so much of ancient life was made from perishable things, yet the stones remain central because the builders chose permanence deliberately. Their legacy is not only archaeological, it is emotional. Megaliths change the way the present feels about deep time. A ruin of a Roman wall may seem ancient. A medieval church may seem old. But a Neolithic tomb, a line of menhirs, or a carved pillar from a world before pottery in some regions reaches beyond ordinary historical imagination. It brings modern people into contact with human beings who lived before most familiar categories existed, before nations, before empires, before alphabets, before classical myths, before the political maps that now divide the world. The distance is immense, yet the contact is strangely direct. A hand shaped that stone, a shoulder strained against a rope. A community watched it rise. The human body becomes the bridge across thousands of years. This is why megaliths continue to attract both science and myth. Science approaches them with dating methods, ground-penetrating radar isotopic analysis, ancient DNA microscopic toolware studies, landscape archaeology, and careful excavation. Myth approaches them with longing. Both begin from the same recognition these stones matter. The difference is that science accepts partial answers, while myth often demands total revelation. Archaeology can say that a tomb was reopened, that cremated remains were placed in certain pits, that stones came from a distant outcrop, that a passage admits solstice light, that a quarry contains unfinished blocks, that a settlement shows feasting. It cannot always say what a grieving parent thought, what a ritual specialist believed, what a child felt when the crowd shouted and the stone shifted upright. No single explanation fully accounts for the inner life of the monuments, because the inner life of any human world is never fully recoverable. Yet incompleteness is not failure. It is the condition of studying deep time. What survives is enough to overturn old assumptions. The stones show that prehistoric societies were more organized, observant, connected, and imaginative than earlier generations often allowed. Göbekli Tepe shows that monumental ritual could emerge before the classic markers of civilization. Stonehenge shows that a landscape can be transformed through centuries of changing ceremony. Karnak shows that repetition across space can become overwhelming. Malta shows that small island societies could create enclosed sacred architecture of extraordinary sophistication. Sardinia shows that towers can turn local identity into a whole island signature. Rapa Nui shows that remote community could carve ancestors into volcanic stone and move them across difficult land. Submerged sites remind us that part of the record is drowned, and astronomical alignments remind us that the sky itself could be built into architecture. The stones also reveal humility. They warn against assuming that people of the past were simpler because their tools were simpler. They warn against forcing modern categories onto ancient minds. They warn against confusing silence with emptiness. A monument without writing is not a monument without thought. It is a monument whose thought must be approached through traces, context, and restraint. The builders may not have separated engineering from ritual astronomy, from ancestry politics, from belief, or labour from ceremony. Their world may have been woven more tightly than ours, with every stone carrying several meanings at once, and still, after all the measurements, after the plans and dates and careful reconstructions, there remains the basic encounter. A person stands before a megalith. The wind moves, the stone does not. Birds cross the sky, grass grows around its base, the surface is cold to the touch. It has outlived the builders, their children, their language, their animals, their houses, their stories, and almost every object they handled. It has survived so long that survival itself has become part of its meaning. The stone no longer belongs only to the people who raised it. It belongs to the long human attempt to leave a mark against disappearance. That may be the deepest reason the ancient megaliths still feel unexplained. Not because archaeology knows nothing, and not because the builders possessed impossible secrets, but because the monuments stand at the meeting point of knowledge and loss. We know enough to recognize human genius. We have lost enough to feel the silence. The stones hold both truths without resolving them. They are evidence and absence at the same time. They tell us that people once gathered, believed, laboured, remembered, watched the heavens, honoured the dead, claimed the land, and built for a future they would never enter. Then they leave us with the hardest part of history, not the fact that people vanish, but the fact that something of them remains. The stones remain after the story slows. They remain after the arguments quiet down, after the theories are tested, after the measurements are taken, after the maps are folded away. In the end, a megalith is still a stone in the weather standing between earth and sky with a patience no human life can match. It does not care what century has arrived. It does not hurry to explain itself. Rain darkens it. Frost opens tiny cracks. Roots press near its base. Birds land on it for a moment, and then leave. Around it the world keeps changing. There is something almost gentle in that endurance. The builders could not have known the names of the nations that would one day surround their monuments. They could not have imagined satellites, excavation reports, museum displays, tourists, drones, protective fences, or people, thousands of years later staring at their work through glowing screens. They built for their own dead, their own seasons, their own fears, their own gods or ancestors or social bonds. Yet by trying to speak to their own world, they accidentally spoke to ours. That is the strange gift of deep time. It makes human ambition look both fragile and immense. A village disappears, but its tomb survives. A language dies, but its stones keep their positions. A belief system fades beyond recovery, but a shaft of winter sunlight still enters a chamber at dawn. The people are gone, and yet they are not entirely gone. Something of their attention remains. Something of their labour remains. Something of their refusal to be erased remains. The ancient megaliths no one can fully explain are not empty riddles waiting for a single clever solution. They are reminders that history is made from both survival and loss. What we know matters. What we cannot know also matters. Between those two spaces, the stones stand asking for humility more than certainty. Perhaps that is why they continue to draw us back. They do not offer the comfort of a complete answer. They offer contact. They let the present touch a world before writing, before empire, before memory became official. They remind us that people have always stood under the same sky, watched the year turn, buried their dead, feared forgetting, and tried to make something last. And somewhere in a field, on a ridge, beside a sea, beneath a mound, or under quiet water, a stone still waits in the old silence. The hands that raised it are gone. The reason may be broken. But the mark remains heavy with weather holding its place as evening gathers around it.